Hello, everyone. My name is Krian Butler, and I'm the Director of the Global Economy and Finance Program at Chatham House. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on the challenges and opportunities of border carbon adjustment. This webinar has been jointly organized by the UK Trade Policy Observatory and the Global Economy and Finance Program in Chatham House. And it's also being supported by Chatham House's Trade Policy Forum. Now, border carbon adjustment is not a new concept, but the level of attention it is receiving now is definitely pretty new. And I think this reflects, first of all, the wide recognition of just the pace at which our economic model is going to have to go through the low carbon transition. The recognition of what this in turn means for the future carbon price, coupled with the fact that the current carbon price is rising rapidly. And also the realization that the notwithstanding President Biden's election in the US, that different regions and different economies are going to move at very, very different paces on that low carbon adjustment. The EU's proposals for a border carbon adjustment mechanism have been leaked, although it's still some way from when the final proposals will appear. And a number of other countries, including the UK, Canada, and the US, have expressed interest in border carbon adjustment. It's also likely, I think, to be on the agenda of the G7 this week. And some have made a connection between the G7's newfound unity on global corporate taxes and the potential for them reaching a common view as to how to approach border carbon adjustment, although I'm sure that's something we'll discuss further during the webinar. On the other hand, implementing border carbon adjustment is far from straightforward and has a potential for many unintended consequences. And certainly as we move towards COP26 at the end of the year, one can see considerable potential for this issue, if badly handled, to damage what may come out of that crucial conference later on. Now, to talk through this subject, we have a really excellent panel. Emily Lydgate, who is Senior Lecturer in Environmental Law at the University of Sussex and Deputy Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, will kick us off with a presentation of 10 or 15 minutes, providing a framework for thinking about border carbon adjustment. And this draws on her recently published UKTPO discussion paper. Next, we'll have two brief comments in response of around 5 minutes each. First from Michael Gazoriak, who's Professor of Economics at the University of Sussex and Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. And Michael will then be followed by a further comment from Caroline Dier-Birkbeck, who's Associate Fellow at Chatham House and Director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs at the Graduate Institute of International Development Studies in Geneva. And we will then move to a broader discussion among the panel and take questions from the audience. And a few quick housekeeping points, just to remind everybody that this session is on the record. It is being recorded, and recording will be made available afterwards. And please post your questions through the Q&A function. And by all means, post questions as soon as they occur to you as the discussion's going on. Try and keep them as short as possible, both so that they're easy to comprehend, but also means that we can get as many questions in as possible. Right, now for the opening presentation, I'll hand over to Emily.
Great, thanks very much. So, as Krian was saying, this is a very timely event. We have Liam Fox and others putting pressure on Boris Johnson to introduce border carbon adjustment. We have the European Commission's draft carbon border adjustment mechanism proposal leaked, and I'll offer some first responses on that. And of course, the trade ministers have identified trade and climate as one of the themes they want to address in the G7, so may or may not make progress on that topic later this week. So I think this slide provides some really important context as well for this discussion on border carbon adjustment. And what we can see here is that for the first time, the EU emissions trading scheme permit price has gone above £50, and the UK's recently introduced emissions trading scheme is sort of fluctuating around EU prices. So this is a really significant moment because for the first time, carbon prices are reaching the kind of rates that climate economists think are necessary to actually make carbon pricing work. That is to say, make high emissions manufacturing expensive and coal prohibitively so. But obviously for for industries in these countries, this doesn't seem like so much of a success story. So what about the three largest global emitters? China is introducing a pilot emissions trading scheme. It's looking like it's going to be trading at around £5 or £6 per ton, which is not too far off where the EU emissions trading scheme started out. In the US, many producers don't pay, but states hugging the coast are paying between around £5 and £12 per ton for emissions. And India doesn't have a national carbon price. So this isn't a sort of a simple story of developed versus developing countries. China has a net zero ambition, and the US is, as in many things, divided. But certainly this is a picture that's, this asymmetry is causing a lot of pressures. So here's a quote from the former CEO of Liberty Steel Continental. He says, European producers are operating at a huge commercial disadvantage to those which are able to import low-cost steel without any respect for European climate policies. The steel industry has been very vocal here, but this applies to all widely traded products for which EU producers and UK producers pay for emissions. And there are also potential climate problems with the chart that I just showed. And this is so-called leakage. So maybe in a few more years, rather than pollution havens, we'll be talking about emissions havens. I'm trying to coin the phrase now. But I put a question mark there because the rate at which companies are actually upping sticks and moving because they want to avoid climate charges is very uncertain. But I think for our purposes, one thing that we can be certain about is, the higher the rate of carbon tax, the higher these charges are going to be. So this is where we come to border carbon adjustment, which, as Creon said, has been around for a while and is in sort of policy circles. And in a sense is quite simple idea of extending carbon prices facing domestic producers to imported products. And the Parliament has voted to introduce this in the EU starting in January 2023. A Commission proposal is going to be published on this in July. The UK may or may not follow suit. We're not sure. Similarly, in the US, there's been very strong sort of mixed signals on this, but there may be some sort of charges applied to imported products, even though there's no national carbon price in the US. And Canada, which does have a national carbon price, is also seriously discussing border carbon adjustment. So you can see there's a very strong transatlantic dimension here. So this means that border carbon adjustment has gone from being this sort of obscure technical topic to something that is, if not in the front page, at least in the news. So these are headlines from the past couple of months. And as you can see, in the UK, according to The Sun, Boris Johnson's dad is an important part of the domestic pressure group here. So despite all these developments, these political developments, we still have many questions about how this will work in practice. So how will it be designed and who will pay it? Who will be exempted from it? And within these sort of two big questions, what I will do now is set out what I see as remaining issues, remaining challenges. And in so doing, I hope to convey a sense of why border carbon adjustment, despite seeming like a relatively simple idea, is a fairly enormous sort of political and regulatory challenge. And also, I think that framing these questions is important to evaluating some of the proposals that we may see coming down the pipeline, including the European Commission's leaked draft proposal. So border carbon adjustment has different sets of policy goals, and some of them seem to be in conflict with one another or pulling in different directions. So I find it useful to think about border carbon adjustment as a policy trilemma, between environmental ambition, technical feasibility, and fairness and non-discrimination with respect to the WTO and also developing countries. So what does this mean in practice? Inevitably, no matter how this is designed, probably someone is going to be disappointed. There will be trade-offs. So let's look at some of these trade-offs. So if we think about sort of the main design questions for border carbon adjustment, the first one is the scope, which just means which imported products are going to be taxed. And the second one is the rate. So that's not only how much will we charge per ton of CO2, but how are we going to know how much CO2 is embedded in each shipment of imported products? Are we going to make each individual installation calculate this? Or are we going to use default rates? If we use default rates, what will they be based on? So if we think about this from an environmental perspective, we'd want the scope to be wide. Any emissions that are taxed domestically, which normally means sort of heavy industry, imports should also be taxed. Also manufactured goods that contain these priced components, because otherwise you'll still get leakage. And there even could be an argument for going beyond the products that are taxed domestically from an environmental perspective. And the main sort of lobby for this in the EU is the agricultural lobby. They say we're paying for all these environmental regulations that our competitors don't face, so we have a problem of leakage. And of course, if the US introduces some form of pricing without a national carbon price, then presumably it will be based on these kind of cost of climate regulation type arguments. You also want the rate to be high enough to be genuinely deterring of exporting these high emissions technologies, and targeted so that the companies that are emitting more are also paying more. But if we think about this from a technical feasibility perspective, the design imperatives move really in the opposite direction. So first of all, including manufactured goods adds a huge number of additional complexities. So you may have components from different countries with different emissions profiles. You need to find some way of tracking these components and also verifying that the pricing methodology is correct. So we're talking about a huge sort of verification and compliance challenge. So ideally, we limit this. We just want it to apply to a few primary commodities, and we want to use standardized default rates fairly widely. Again, just thinking about this from a technical feasibility perspective, say for an SME or a customs officer. But then on top of this, we have pressures coming in from the WTO, because remember, inconvenient truth about border carbon adjustment is that it's actually designed to protect domestic producers from foreign competition. So it needs to be designed and implemented very carefully to comply with the WTO non-discrimination rules. So to make this more likely, again, we're looking at probably a narrower scope. Why is that? Well, it has to do with the way that WTO environmental exceptions are crafted, which requires there to be a strong environmental rationale. So you'd want to be able to point to a chart and say, look, leakage is happening in these sectors. We can prove it. Therefore, we need this trade restriction. You want to make sure that the base rate charged is the same or lower than that the domestic producers face. And there has to be some sort of, if default rates, some sort of way of appealing and saying, hey, we actually emit less than this, so we should be charged less. And there's another big question here about developing countries who have less responsibility to mitigate climate change. That's set out in the Paris Agreement. So is it fair to charge developing countries based on the prices that EU or UK producers are facing? There's an argument that this goes against the Paris Agreement, and indeed a subset of developing countries aren't really contributing much to emissions or leakage at all. So if we think about this sort of, this is, by the way, is far from comprehensive. It's just, outlining some of the hard choices that are going to have to be made in designing a carbon border adjustment mechanism or border carbon adjustment. But if we look at the EU's proposal, in the light of this trilemma, and again, this is just a draft, so it's subject to change even before it's been sort of formally published rather. I would say it scores sort of middlingly on environmental goals. It just covers a few sectors and 4 sectors, and even within those, the coverage is incomplete. But it's quite a high rate. It's calibrated to the EU emissions trading scheme. And it's targeted in the sense that the default rates that the EU has provided are very high. So companies will really be incentivized to try to have targeted rates. In terms of technical feasibility, I would say it scores pretty low. It's very administratively complex. That means that basically companies have to apply to be listed to export. They have to calculate their indirect and direct emissions using a complex formula, and there has to be third-party verification that these rates are correct. In terms of WTO, non-discrimination, it could be fairly good. It depends a bit on the rationale for the covered products within these 4 sectors. And if it's really carefully calibrated on leakage, that would make it fairly likely to comply. There's a couple of gray areas that I won't go into for lack of time. But it notably scores very low in terms of developing countries in fairness, because there's no exemptions for developing countries. So we could definitely expect to see some pushback on this proposal from exporters due to the technical complexity, and from developing countries due to the concerns about fairness. So very briefly, for the final comment, I'll look at the second big question going forward into the sort of the G7 and the COP, which is, if countries are going to apply border carbon adjustment, how will they work together on them? And this harkens back to William Nordhaus's idea, Nobel Prize-winning idea of climate clubs, and which is that absent a high international carbon price, countries with ambitious targets can band together against the rest of the world and impose import duties on them. So we certainly have some potential for a transatlantic climate club, but not much idea about what countries would require to waive charges, from each other. So on one end of the spectrum, we could just say, well, we share a net zero target. So that would be a relatively wide open climate club. Or maybe this is a much more nuanced question about, do we have similar prices or equivalent prices within sectors and in particular goods? Or the most restrictive option would be to actually require that we have the same CO2 pricing, because we have linked our emissions trading schemes. So if we look again at the Commission's draft proposal, it's limited. It has a very limited list of countries that are exempted altogether. And these are the ones that are part of the ETS or have linked schemes. So the UK, for example, is not included in that list. But it also opens up the scope for negotiating sectoral agreements based on having equivalent or comparable prices. So I think what this border carbon adjustment debate is doing is opening up a new set of questions for international trade cooperation and climate cooperation that will possibly drive some really interesting innovation in terms of international law. I think the WTO could play some sort of a role here. Border carbon adjustment is on the agenda of the WTO structured discussion on trade and environmental sustainability. This is obviously very far from a plurilateral, but at least it's certainly a starting point. So I'll be very interested to hear what my co-panelists think about this. I have also, as Kriyan said, written up some of these thoughts in a recent briefing paper, which you can find on the UKTPO website. So thank you very much.
Emily, thank you very much. That sets us up extremely well for the discussion, and I think you've highlighted all the myriad of issues that people are going to face as they grapple with the subject. So for our first comment, over to Michael. I don't know, Michael.
Hi, sorry, I was having trouble with my audio and now I'm having trouble with my camera. Just give me a minute here. Okay, I think I'm there. Apologies for that slight delay. Okay, thank you very much, Kriyan, and thank you very much, Emily. Really like the presentation and the briefing paper itself. And I really like the idea of conceptualizing or thinking about BCAs, border carbon adjustments, as a trilemma. I've got three sets of comments or thoughts that I want to make here. So the first is on the trilemma itself. So what the trilemma here is that from an environmental perspective, CBA should capture as many CO2 emissions as possible, which suggests they should be wide-ranging. From a technical perspective, calculating the amount of CO2 is tricky, so that suggests maybe they need to be narrower. And then we have the third leg, if you like, the third element of the trilemma, which is to do with equity and non-discrimination, which involves not discriminating between domestic producers nor trading partners and taking into account in particular the needs of developing countries. So my thoughts on this are, and I've been reflecting upon this since I read the briefing paper, is what are the parameters for each of the above? And clearly there is this trilemma. It's a really nice way of conceptualizing it. But what is binding here? Where are the binding constraints and what are the parameters with respect to each of the above? Now, in some sense, the environmental objective here is kind of unconstrained, unbounded. We want to maximize our reductions in emissions as much as possible, although obviously speaking as an economist, we want to weigh up the costs and benefits. With regard to equity and non-discrimination, the third, if you like, element of that trilemma, I'll come back to the technical in a moment, it seems to me there are actually two issues here. The first issue is that of non-discrimination, making sure you treat countries and firms from those countries in a non-discriminatory manner, and that leads into all those issues of WTO compatibility, which Emily talked about. And a slightly separate issue is that of equity, and in particular taking into account the needs of developing countries and how to make the system fair. The third element of the trilemma is the technical side of things. And to my mind, this provides a real binding constraint in many ways. How do you calculate the emissions embedded in production? How do you calculate the BCA, the border carbon adjustment that you want to make, given the emissions? And how do you even set this up procedurally, documentation, enforcement, and so on? All of this really matters from the point of view of working out which sectors, industries, firms to tax, and then how to make that tax fair and non-discriminatory, which leads us to that third bit of the trilemma, the equity and non-discrimination. And it seems to me the binding constraint here, the issue that really countries need to resolve and cooperate on, is the technical side, and then that then is going to free up progress on the equity and non-discrimination side and on the environmental side. The better we get at resolving the technical issues, the easier it'll be to make the system fairer. That kind of leads me on to my second point, which is to do with how countries could think about cooperating and international cooperation in this domain. Carbon pricing is complicated. Border carbon pricing is complicated. It adds bureaucratic costs as well as carbon costs. As Emily said, she scored the EU sort of leaked draft proposals fairly low on the technical side because she said they're very, very complicated. Okay, and they are complicated, and to some extent there's an element of inevitability about this. So carbon pricing is complicated. But BCAs are more likely to work and meet the environmental objectives if they provide the right incentives for polluting countries to pollute less. Now, that sounds a little bit obvious, but I think it's worth stating, because those incentives to pollute less will be higher, that incentive will be higher, the bigger is the market the polluting country is exporting to, and the lower the possibilities of exporting elsewhere and just diverting your production and exports to elsewhere. So that suggests that BCAs are more likely to be effective, both the larger other countries going down this route and the more countries that participate in some form of border carbon adjustment, some form of, if you like, carbon clubs, stroke plurilateral, which Emily alluded to. So that raises the question, to my mind, of what is the incentive for countries to participate? You could argue that making the scheme, as the EU has done, complicated, expensive, could encourage other countries, should such a scheme be open to other countries, to then try and exceed the scheme precisely to overcome those additional costs, the reduced market access that the complication of that scheme engenders. So you're trying to solve the problem you're trying to address by encouraging countries, as many countries, to be part of such a scheme or to cooperate on such schemes as much as possible. And that therefore to my mind, pushes the debate that there is a strong incentive here, or there could be a strong incentive here for countries to try and resolve this plurilaterally, as opposed to, if you like, unilaterally or bilaterally. And of course, that raises difficult questions about how to determine the rules for joining the club. But with the G7 discussions coming up at the end of this week, with the COP meetings in November and so on, it strikes me there is a window here for some leadership to be shown to move forward on border carbon adjustments, because I can't see a future without border carbon adjustments. I think we will have these. But in some sense, the more countries go down that route, the less likely we need to have them. And that's part of the incentive of trying to move down the notion of some form of carbon club stroke plurilateral. But on that note, I think I should stop.
Michael, thank you very much. And there's a tantalizing prospect, if you like, of sort of a broad set of principles for this plurilateral approach, which may be one of the ways to bring that group together. Excellent. And for our further final comment, I'm very pleased to welcome Caroline. Over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Creon, for the invitation to be here. And thank you, Emily, for the great presentation, and Michael for your comments. Now, I don't consider myself to be an expert on the details of BCAs. However, I do closely follow multilateral discussions on trade, environment, and sustainable development, and hope that I can bring a little of this Geneva perspective to this discussion. So I have four general points to share. Is that the first is the importance of multilateral approaches to climate and trade diplomacy. So the focus here is on transatlantic approaches, and indeed it's important that we identify ways for key players with affirmed commitments to more ambitious climate action to coordinate and cooperate where they can. But moving toward a decarbonized global economy will require ambitious and rapid economic transformation in all countries, and attention to how to secure a just transition for all countries. Now, as Emily has pointed out, existing climate impacts, as well as climate risks and climate policies, will impact trade and competitiveness. And approaches to climate policies and their intersections with trade will have implications for a wider trade cooperation. These warrant greater consideration. We need to ensure that our trade policies and our climate policies incentivize and support countries everywhere to decarbonize, to adapt to climate change, and also to thrive economically and socially. So my point here is that while transatlantic cooperation is key and we need to find ways for the top emitters to work together, we also need to focus on enabling and fostering a robust dialogue, or a more robust dialogue, with the rest of the world, and especially the world's developing countries. So my appeal here is for that multilateral dialogue, and also to the idea that the WTO is one place where this dialogue could and should happen, and where governments could discuss principles, guidelines, and other options, and BCAs could be discussed in this context. So second, on BCAs specifically, Emily and Michael have already noted a lot of questions. I think here, my observation is that we need a whole lot more transparency and consultation as governments are working through these. And by that, I mean consultation with your trading partners that will be impacted as these policies go forward. And I think this is particularly important because there's a lot of fear and concern about the scope of policies like BCAs and uncertainty. And some of that generates a lot more ill will and hostility than might be necessary if countries understood better that in fact some of these have a very narrow scope, at least at present. There's just so many unknowns, and I think that these warrant so much more dialogue than is currently undertaken. The third point is that we need to consider the implications of BCAs for trade cooperation more widely, and for climate cooperation, and the link between the two. So it's important we remind ourselves that this discussion of BCAs comes at a time when developing countries are facing the brunt of the COVID crisis, the climate crisis, and a massive economic crisis and collapse of trade. So the pandemic has already provoked an array of trade tensions, not least around access to vaccines, essential food and medical supplies. And for many countries, issues of economic recovery are central. And many of these same countries are also deeply concerned about climate change. And in fact, it's often developing countries and the least developed countries that are facing immediate and existing impacts of climate change. It's not a far off distant prospect for them. They face natural disasters, flood, fires, droughts, cyclones, all of which impact their production and their trade. So they have an intrinsic interest in this issue. We're not at a stage where developing countries aren't willing to discuss environment issues and their impacts on trade. They know that they impact their trade and their economies. But we have to recall that this whole discussion around climate and trade intersections and BCAs comes at a time when developed countries are failing to provide adequate climate finance. There are huge gaps in investment and trade finance for green products and exports from developing countries. And there are cuts in development budgets. Developed countries are not living up to their commitments at UNFCCC regarding technology transfer, and so on. And at the same time, we have many developing countries with long-standing concerns about non-tariff barriers and how they impact their exports. So for many of them, a key question is, how do we pursue trade and climate policy intersections in ways that are consistent with the spirit of the Paris Agreement, and in particular with special and differential treatment? So I mention all of this because I think it shapes the context for cooperation on trade and climate intersections. Now, in good news, there are important developments at the multilateral level. We have a new Director General at the WTO who stressed the need to ensure that the WTO addresses the nexus between trade and climate change. Over 53 countries have sponsored the launch of structured discussions on trade and environmental sustainability, many of which are developing countries. And many countries who are not co-sponsors are listening in. The meetings engage a broad range of the membership. And last week, the G7 trade ministers affirmed their commitments to working through this process at the WTO. So the key is to see how we can harness that process specifically to promote dialogue around climate and trade policy issues, to look at some of the principles that countries could look at as their developing needs. And finally, and I will be quick, Creon, is I think it's important that the BCA discussion doesn't dominate or indeed obscure a wider trade and climate agenda. Of course, the BCAs are at the moment sort of the hottest climate and trade issue on the agenda, but they're only one piece of a much bigger puzzle. So other issues on the table that warrant international cooperation and trade cooperation are climate-related standards, fossil fuel subsidy reform, trade-related transportation emissions, deforestation-free supply chains, boosted aid for trade-related climate adaptation, and the promotion of climate-friendly exports or exports of essential climate technologies. There's also scope for discussion in the trade context of climate policies linked to that involve subsidies and green procurement and their impact on trade. So on all of these issues, there's a strong need for dialogue and for a focus on how we can link climate and trade policies in a way that serve climate ambition and advance climate ambition, but are also fair and address some of the competitiveness concerns of countries. So as I mentioned before, I think one mechanism for dialogue is the structured discussions at the WTO. And there's also scope for WTO members to agree to create a specific working group, for example, to discuss climate and trade issues at MC12. Another idea is for a trade ministers coalition on climate action. And here I'm doing some advertising for a forthcoming Chatham House publication in which I propose that the creation of such a coalition, it could be convened, for instance, by the Director General at the WTO, and its purpose would be to spur high-level political engagement and technical dialogue on these complex questions at the multilateral level. So I hope these 4 points are useful to the discussion, and back to you, Creon.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you for putting this in that broader context. I think we should certainly come back to some of the specific proposals. So what I'd like to now do is move to broader discussion across the panel and also Q&A. And we've already got some questions coming in, some good questions, but I'd really encourage everybody to put their questions in as quickly as possible. And also, if I could encourage the panelists to come on video, that would be great as well, technology permitting. One thing I'd like to kick off on, actually, we've sort of talked around this issue, but is really about the specific role of the UK in this year in relation to border carbon adjustment, not just because of the G7 presidency, but also because of COP26 later this year. And I mean, I'm sort of in Michael's camp of thinking that this is kind of inevitable at some stage, some kind of border carbon adjustment mechanism or border carbon adjustment. But I wonder, Emily, if I could come to you first, really on how either A, what you think the UK is going to do, or B, if you were the UK, what you would recommend they should do, given the complexities around this issue. Thank you.
I would really love to know what kind of conversations are happening in the cabinet around this. I mean, I think there's obviously quite strong drivers for the UK to seize this one. It has prohibitive climate costs for domestic industry right now. I think, there's a very strong sense of this is something that the UK could really plausibly operate a leadership role on, and with this sort of role with relationship with the EU and with the US, who are the and Canada, who are countries who are discussing this quite seriously now. So certainly the potential is there, but we haven't yet seen a UK proposal. So there's obviously pushback as well. So until we can see if the UK can come to the table with a proposal that or some certainty about introducing this and what it's going to look like, I think that will put it in a much clearer position in terms of talking to different parties, because now it's sort of remaining agnostic on whether we're going to have this or not. So I think that makes it much trickier to be a leader.
Thanks. And Michael, or any thoughts on this? Yeah, you're muted, I think. Sorry.
Apologies again. Not a lot to add to what Emily has said. I agree it's a little bit hard for the UK to show a leadership role when it's not clear what the UK's position is on this in the first place. Having said that, I think that the moment is kind of ripe for a leadership role to emerge here. There's clearly a lot of interest in this. We've got the Commission's leaked proposals and the proposals that are due to come out in July. There is a bit of momentum and development in this space, and therefore there is clearly an opportunity for the UK to try and give some leadership on this if it wishes to do so. That's also complicated by the fact that the UK is in many ways trying to show that it has an independent voice from the EU, and therefore to go down a route which appears to be similar to the EU's route, i.e. in favour of CBAs, might be tricky for the UK as well. So I think there's a difficult balancing act to play. And finally, I should say, I don't think we should overestimate the influence of the UK at these meetings. It has some influence. It clearly has a role to play. And given that it has the presidency of the G7 and of the COP26, there is the scope to try and give leadership here, but it's hard to see what that would be without knowing more what the UK government actually thinks.
Thanks, Michael. Caroline, you may want to comment on the previous question, but I wonder if I could just put another question to you now, which actually goes to some of the points you were making in your comment, which is really around the question of the how you make it fair. So one of the elements in Emily's trilemma vis-a-vis developing countries. Now there is an argument actually. One should not try and do this through the border carbon adjustment mechanism. That's complicated enough as it is. Rather, one should do it through other things, such as technology transfer, aid for development of the green economy, infrastructure, and so on. And in a sense, do it through that way, rather than trying to build elements into the border carbon adjustment mechanism or border carbon adjustment itself. So my question really is whether you think that is a sensible way to go, or whether you think, through the dialogues and so on, the developing countries, the poorest countries, will want to see something hardwired into the border carbon adjustment mechanism itself. Yep. Sorry, Michael. Yeah, I'll come back to you after. So Caroline, then Michael. Yep.
Great. Well, they're huge questions, so my brain is going to struggle a little bit. Just firstly on the UK, I mean, I personally feel like the UK should not lead on BCAs. The UK is the president of COP26 this year. Its goal should be to find ways to draw together the highest level of ambition it can around COP26. It already has enough issues on the table with getting developing countries on board as I mentioned, in the context of this failure to provide many of these long promised technology transfer, aid, financing, and so on. So introducing something that many developing countries perceive as something that's that's sort of a slap in the face to them is really not a great diplomatic move, in my view. If it doesn't stop the UK from doing it later if it wants to, but this year, I don't think it's a winning formula for COP26. I mean, let the EU move ahead with that. Let's see what Canada puts out on the table. I know, and also I think that one thing to bear in mind is we really don't know where the US stands on this. We have talk from various industry groups, but no one sees the US introducing carbon pricing anytime soon, right? So then we're not really talking about something like the CBAM. We're talking about something else, in which case we should frame the discussion around how do we coordinate among divergent regulatory approaches to dealing with climate action. That's the discussion. It's not about putting things up at the border or not. And I mean, ideally, from a trade policy point of view, you'd be looking for all of the other ways that you can cooperate around things like climate standards and other things before you go to border measures. And I would really appeal to everyone. I mean, at the moment, we're talking about a BCA that applies to a very narrow set of sectors. No one's talking about it applying to agriculture, to food, to all kinds of manufacturing products, to all kinds of other sectors of the economy that we also need to decarbonize. So we risk really undermining looking at what else trade policy can do. Like, trade policy can be used to enhance the diffusion of some of these technologies around the world on fair terms. We can, I just feel like there's a whole other discussion to be had, and we end up poisoning a lot of this through a discussion that's not to say the BCA discussion should be dismissed altogether, but we shouldn't let it dominate our discussion on climate and trade diplomacy. It's a mechanism. It's not going to necessarily have that much climate impact on the global scale yet. It may expand. Who knows? But I think a really key thing just in terms of BCAs itself is that, very few developing countries are going to be satisfied with the idea of a promise of technology transfer or development assistance, because they've got no evidence on which to assume that this is actually going to happen. So I think we do need to have a more structured discussion. And I don't think it's also just about carve-outs for LDCs. I mean, most of them don't export steel, iron, or whatever it is to developed countries anyway. So it's more about having a broader discussion with them about how we're going to help them make the economic transition and transformation that they need to do, not be shut out of key markets, help them meet whatever requirements there are for key markets. And also the same for all these middle-income developing countries. They're the ones that are most likely to be competitors in some of these sectors, and that we want them to move. I mean, the whole point of this is that we want the climate ambition. I'm just not convinced that BCAs are the way to take the rest of the world with us.
Thanks, Caroline. I think Michael, then Emily.
Yeah, I had two things I wanted to say, partly in response to what Caroline just said regarding the UK's leadership role on this. And maybe I was slightly unclear in the way I phrased things earlier. I don't think that the UK should lead on arguing for BCAs necessarily. I think at the end of the day, a few years down the line, BCAs will be in play. What I think the UK should be leading on now is on framing the discussion that we should be having about BCAs, their remit, their parameters, precisely in the way that Caroline was talking about. So I think the discussion needs to be had, and the earlier in groupings such as the G7, those discussions are had, the more likely we are to understand the way in which BCAs may or may not prove to be useful in the future, and how to sort of set the parameters for how to deal with those BCAs, as opposed to the UK taking a leadership role in the sense of, oh yeah, we're promoting BCAs. That's more the way I would think about things. In terms of the EU's proposal and exemptions for developing countries in dealing with that, two comments to make. The first is that, yes, I was surprised that there was no discussion of exemptions for developing countries. Secondly, is there a way of potentially handling the issue of fairness with regard to developing countries? Well, there is one way that it could be in the context of the EU's proposals, which is how you set the default rate. So at the moment, the default rate, if a producer can't prove what their emissions are, there's a default rate which is applied. And that default rate in the current proposals is set quite harshly because it's set to be the average of the 10% of the worst EU producers, for example. And I'm sure that's sort of an opening gambit to some extent by the EU. But one way that you could think about differentiating between groups of countries or between developing countries and non-developing countries is precisely by how you set that default rate.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this is one of several ways one might begin to go. Emily, to you.
I just wanted to sort of amplify that. I mean, I think in some way a more fruitful way of thinking about carbon border adjustment is not in terms of or border carbon adjustment. Sorry, I fluctuate. Is not sort of to BCA or not to BCA, this kind of question, but rather thinking about it in terms of a kind of a gap in the Paris Agreement, which is it tells us all we need to decarbonize, but it doesn't provide very much guidance about how we're going to do that and how we're going to deal with these competitive asymmetries. So if we can hash those issues out within the context of the Paris Agreement, then that is a much more fruitful way of dealing with them. It's very much a failure of multilateralism that's giving rise to this. And I just wanted to briefly highlight another important context for that discussion, which is negotiations on carbon pricing.
Yes, indeed. I mean, there is a big push from the IMF and others on the carbon pricing per se. That, I mean, it's very striking from that many of on the economic and financial side are pushing the issue of carbon pricing above everything else as being the priority, and that obviously has a knock-on effect vis-a-vis this discussion. Emily, I wonder if I could come to you next with actually one of the questions we've been asked, which is from Dan Crossley, which is, what would you expect the implications of BCA, if done well, what would you expect them to be for food and farming? And this is in the context of an event that he's holding. And he says, what are the key questions you think we should be asking? So I wonder if, I mean, bearing in mind, this isn't where the EU is at the moment, but it could be in the future. What views you have on that?
Hi, Dan. So I think the question, the tricky thing about agriculture is that it's actually, even in the EU, it's an emitting sector. So it's a sector that's contributing to CO2 emissions, maybe more so in some countries than others, but that's really hard to measure and verify. So then you get to this question of, well, are we going to try to apply carbon border adjustment or border carbon adjustment in sectors that we don't do it domestically? Or are we going to extend carbon pricing to agriculture, which actually agriculture producers I don't think would welcome, because while they might, their competitors might pay higher prices, they might have to then pay prices that they're not paying now. So it is a very tricky area, very, very tricky.
Thanks, Emily. I don't know, Michael or Caroline, any thoughts on agriculture? I think, Caroline, you were saying that this is just an example of where, how broad the whole range of issues are that have to be addressed. But
I mean, I would just say on agriculture, we have a huge global issue around the sustainability of agriculture, not just related to climate, but also around nature and pollution. And there also we have a larger discussion to be had. I mean, there are calls from some for minimum international standards for agriculture that address sort of climate and nature issues. They may be a more productive way of bringing everybody up. Many countries face, or there's just a proliferation of sustainability standards around food and agriculture, and we will see more of them added around carbon footprint and food miles and all of these things. I think there's a collective interest in rationalizing some of this and coming up with a clearer framework. I'm not really sure how BCAs help with that. And then also, if we think about sustainable agriculture, there are several issues on, there's the deforestation-free supply chains issue, but there are also long-standing issues from developing countries there around agricultural subsidies from developed countries, and the fact that these distort international markets and put more pressure on natural resource producers and agricultural producers. There are concerns around environmentally harmful subsidies to fertilizers and water use and so on. So there's a bigger discussion to be had around how do we build more sustainable agricultural markets in the world, of which climate is one piece. And I would not say that BCAs are a useful way of addressing one of the hardest trade policy issues there is around trade in agricultural products, and ones that's intrinsically important, not only to large industrial producers in developing countries, but to millions of smallholders and, and marginal communities around the world.
Caroline, thank you very much. I think that sounds like good advice. I wonder, Michael, if I could come to you with a question that Emily Rhodes has asked, which is, with the UK working to secure trade deals in the short to medium term, how can FTAs be future-proofed to accommodate BCA regulations? Any views on this?
Well, I guess you can write all sorts of clauses into an FTA in some sense if you wanted to. I mean, one example of this is the UK-EU TCA, the agreement the UK has signed with the EU, which in some sense has built in an element of future-proofing on sort of carbon and carbon emissions. So it is possible to do, but typically FTAs tend not to do that. So there was also the recently announced FTA between the UK and EFTA, which I think was released on Friday. I had a quick skim of that, and I don't think there's anything like that in that agreement, for example. So it's possible, but rarely done.
Indeed, and obviously an extra complication the UK may have relates to the current arrangements with Northern Ireland. So Emily, I wonder if I know this is something we were talking about beforehand. I'm not asking you to answer the question, but perhaps you could just highlight what you think, how you see this issue and how it could be a real focus for the UK in the future.
No, not the Northern Ireland question. No, I think this is just yet another example where poor Northern Ireland is really caught between two regulatory regimes. In this case, some of its ETS pricing is part of the single electricity market with the rest Republic of Ireland. Its climate targets managed under UK legislation. So I guess it's a question of whether there could be a sort of a more systematic way of building carbon border adjustment into the protocol, some sort of exemption, because clearly in practice, the carbon pricing is more or less the same between the UK and EU. So is there a way of building that in systematically, or is this just going to be a case of producers from Northern Ireland having to individually prove that they can be exempted? So it's just going to be yet another sort of messy issue in which there will be a lot of drivers for the EU and the UK to cooperate, and a question of the extent to which they're capable of doing so.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of drivers there for the UK and the EU to cooperate, but it yet again raises another potential sort of flashpoint, an area of disagreement and tension. You would have thought that there is scope for agreement, for derogations, for somehow building this into the Northern Ireland Protocol. But as we are seeing, sort of relations and those discussions are currently not going very smoothly, and this just raises another problem, stroke complication. Thank you.
Indeed. I wonder if we could now just look at outside, if you like, the G7 or the advanced countries, but also the poorest countries. What sort of stance one might expect from the emerging economies, who, as Caroline pointed out, are potential competitors in some of the sectors where this is most likely to be progressed rapidly. But at the same time, if you look at a country like China, it already has a carbon pricing scheme, and it's been interestingly quiet so far, relatively quiet about its view on this. So do you think there will be a situation in which we find some emerging economies actually coming in behind this and others not? Or do you think there will be a sort of quite a sharp division between advanced and emerging economies? And maybe I could come back to Michael actually first on that from the sort of more geopolitical perspective, and then maybe either Emily or Caroline may want to comment as well.
Sure. I don't think I've got a very informed answer on this in the sense of, I think that I think there are likely to be differences between the emerging economies. And I think it is interesting that China has been relatively quiet on this at present, and it's hard to know, therefore, how to read this. I think that clearly the more the more emerging economies buy into the notion of the possibility of BCAs, then the more likely it is that they will be successful, but also paradoxically then they get less needed. The more people join the club, the less you need to introduce these policies. But as to which way they will jump or swing, no, I don't have any more to add on that.
Thank you. Emily, any thoughts particularly on China or other particular players in this respect?
Well, the countries that have been quite vocal about this already, we've had sort of Russia, Australia. So it's some countries I think are opposing it just as a matter of principle because they don't like the precedent of it and they're not interested in the idea of a climate club. And then there's the countries that are affected more economically, of which I think the UK might be at the forefront. But I think that yes. There's going to be widespread opposition to this amongst sort of emerging economies, would be my guess. And I think part of that is and here I'm referring to the CBAM draft proposal. I think the way that that's drafted is going to be quite intensive in terms of the administrative burden and potentially the cost burden. So I also wonder if the EU is kind of informally vetting this, so they've leaked it to just see what happens and may make some changes. But I think this is going to be something to watch.
I guess that wouldn't be the first time. Very good, thank you. I wonder if I could just go to a question that Emily Jones has put. In fact, she put two questions, but I think one of them we've already addressed, which is around the link between CBA and other things that can be done to support developing countries. I mean, she has this interesting idea actually that you turn it round. So you say it's only when you're providing support that you actually apply CBA to developing countries. So when you are providing technology transfer, when you are providing green finance, then that's a situation that enables you to include them in a CBA regime. But the question I really wanted to focus on was that she says, does this basically mean that the ideal endpoint is a worldwide ETS, and therefore that's the one way of sort of heading off the CBA argument? I don't know if she's specifically by saying ETS, she's thinking of that approach as opposed to a carbon tax or something of that kind. But any views on that question more generally? Maybe Caroline, first of all, is that where we should all be heading?
I think it's a great question, not one I'm well equipped to answer. And I mean, obviously in an ideal world, we'd be heading to global carbon pricing, which would probably help all of this because we wouldn't have the same need for these adjustment mechanisms if that's what we had. So to the extent that that's partly what ETS does, then that would be a good thing. It's just the question is whether some of these countries or industries backing these proposals will hold on and wait for that. So politically, I think that's a sort of a different issue. One thing I did just wanted to underline, just back to your point before, was I think for when we think about developing country reactions to this, we really need to remember there's just a vast diversity of countries with a vast diversity of industrial interests. So at the moment, CBAM's about iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, and cement, I think. Well, there's a huge range of sectors that are not part of that. There's only a subset of countries that produce and export these things. So only those ones are directly affected by CBAM. However, I think what you will find is there's developing countries who have a more principled opposition to the concept, A, because they don't know where it will go next in terms of scope, but also because they don't see how it reflects this wider spirit of the climate convention, and also because it's not actually about helping incentivize or provide them support to shift. If that's what it's really about, is helping them decarbonize and move up and export greener goods, then that's what an initiative from the world's most powerful countries needs to be about providing. I'm thinking about the Ghanas, the Nigerias, the South Africas, Indonesias, the Malaysias, and we haven't spoken about India today at all either. Like, these are the countries that we need to persuade to be part of this party, and so they're not the poorest. They've got resources domestically, so it's also about inspiring the policy shift domestically that enable this change. But yeah. Yeah,
I mean, I think you highlight the key point really, that there is on the one hand a goal of in the advanced countries of encouraging the accelerated low carbon transition. On the other hand, there's also a goal of preserving competitive advantage in sectors, and these two things are kind of vying in this proposal.
Well, I just think one really specific point, if I may just add, is that developed countries, the US is about to put, what's the proposal, trillions of dollars into backing an economic transition through subsidies, through procurement, through all kinds of measures. How many developing countries can come close to match that in terms of building their national green industries? And then how are they going to do that in the face of BCAs? If they want to be part of tomorrow's global economy and participate more and reap more value from it, and that's going to be green, then we have to.
Indeed. Well, unfortunately, I'm afraid we've now come to the end of our time, but I wanted to give each of our panelists, starting with Emily, the chance for any final 30-second thought before we wrap up. So Emily, then Michael, and then Caroline.
So I would just say it's really a response to the previous question, but if we're being solution oriented here, then I do think that a global carbon price is the obvious solution. And I don't think that a lot of multinationals, and again, as Caroline said, we're really talking about a few commodities, many of which are produced by multinationals, I don't think are necessarily against this principle either, because it would provide stability, predictability, and an international approach. But having said that, if we look at the EU's experience, how did those prices get so high? Well, there's really strong sort of supply side factors there, limiting the number of permits. And if we think about sort of the cleaner development mechanism or past international examples of carbon pricing, they haven't really been so successful. So I think we can hold that up as a goal, but then there are some questions about how we get there.
Thank you very much. Yes. Michael.
Yeah, a couple of points. The first is I really agree with a lot of what Carolyn was saying about the range of other policies and support for developing countries with regard to a sort of a green carbon transition and so on, and that BCAs are not the answer to that. But that doesn't necessarily make them a policy which should not be considered as part of the overall package. What the problem is, if you just introduce a CBAM or a carbon border adjustment and do nothing else, then it looks very both disjointed and unbalanced, as it were. But just because you're not introducing those other policies doesn't necessarily make a border carbon adjustment a bad policy in and of itself. And one of the reasons for that is that what you're trying to do, not always effectively with the BCA, is to address the competitiveness issue and the carbon leakage issue. And that those two issues do need addressing.
Thank you very much. And final thought from Caroline.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for bringing us back to that. I mean, indeed, I did not mean to come across as anti-BCA entirely. It's this anti-discussion dominated by the BCA question, because I just feel that the climate and trade discussion is so much richer, and to make progress on the tremendous climate ambition we need to see we have a varied toolbox before us, and we need to be willing to talk about what's in that overall toolbox, and just to promote more dialogue on these issues. And it might sound trite, but I would not underestimate the degree to which the majority of the world's countries feel completely excluded from this discussion. And anything that we can do to take leadership to engage them in it, understand their interests, their concerns, how they may come on board, all of those things, we need to spend more time on that.
Thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, as I say, this is now the end of our webinar. It just remains for me, first of all, to thank our audience for being with us today and for their really excellent questions, but also particularly to thank our three panelists, Emily, Michael, and Caroline, for some really fascinating insights and some good discussion. I'd also like to thank the teams in UKTPO and Chatham House for putting this together. And really, until next time, all the best.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.